Thank you, Hindu. Thank you very much, firstly, to the Pontifical Academies for the invitation and to everybody here for this incredibly rich experience. It's really amazing. For those of you who don't know Survival, we're a human rights organisation working with Indigenous peoples, principally focusing on land rights and self-determination. So I'll dive into my topic, which is looking at particularly nature-based solutions with a critical eye. Efforts to address the climate crisis vary in the extent to which they recognise the specific perspectives and roles of Indigenous peoples. And even those responses which purport to acknowledge the centrality of Indigenous people often pay lip service to Indigenous engagement without being rooted in or in any way properly taking into account the rights of Indigenous peoples, and in particular their collective land rights. By failing to properly respect Indigenous rights, current efforts to tackle the climate and biodiversity crises are threatening Indigenous peoples while also falling far short of meeting their own aspirations. So I'll just sort of set out how Indigenous rights really are the starting point, and it's not only a moral and legal imperative, but it will also lead to better outcomes, as everybody here, I think, knows very well. So increasingly, projects to address climate change are being designed or branded as nature-based solutions, which sounds innocuous or even positive. Yet such projects in Indigenous territories often result in land theft and are increasingly commodifying Indigenous lands and their knowledge, posing serious threats to their right without necessarily tackling the cause of the climate crisis. So NPS uses mechanisms, as I'm sure you know, such as planting trees, restoring habitats, and preserving forests to absorb or avoid release of atmospheric CO2. So nature is considered a capital or an asset where, for example, polluting companies can buy carbon credits to offset their CO2 emissions. Indigenous peoples' careful stewardship of their territories means they store much CO2, and a recent study found that Indigenous community forests contain 36% more carbon per hectare than other areas of the Brazilian Amazon. So as a result, Indigenous territories are prime territories for NBS carbon offsetting schemes. These NBS are heavily promoted and supported by governments, companies, particularly the fossil fuel industry, and financial markets, and are frequently imposed without Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent. The conservation industry is pushing carbon offsetting hard because it can make huge sums of money selling carbon credits from protected areas which it's creating and managing and evicting Indigenous peoples. However, NBS has failed to tackle the central issue. They enable the biggest polluters and emitters of carbon dioxide to carry on polluting as usual. So the huge monetary value that NBS puts on Indigenous-owned ecosystems makes them the targets of unscrupulous investors, of which I'll say more later, putting more pressure on territories that are already invaded and plundered. As Tom Goldtooth of the Diné people and Executive Director of the Indigenous Environmental Network says, and I quote, "What we are fighting here is the privatization of nature. Who owns nature? The way things are developing, it will be the corporations that own nature. Energy companies are getting richer while the local people suffer." So moving on to protected areas, fortress conservation is still being pushed by big conservation NGOs as the solution to our environmental problems. Indigenous organizations and NGOs like Survival have denounced widespread and horrific human rights abuses, especially in Africa and Asia, where Indigenous peoples have been violently evicted from their lands by armed rangers funded by the large conservation organizations. Once their land is stolen, Indigenous people's sustainable way of life are criminalized, and they're pushed into so-called alternative livelihoods to conform to so-called mainstream society. So self-sufficient people are rendered landless, while the real culprits of environmental destruction, like mining, oil, and logging companies, are considered partners of conservation and allowed to carry on business as usual. So African Parks has been at the forefront of the militarization of conservation in areas in Africa and runs the largest counter-poaching force of any private organization on the continent. Other conservation organizations like WWF and WCS are also deeply involved. Rangers often receive paramilitary training from former military officers. In some cases, bonuses are awarded to the most zealous rangers who've made the most arrests or discovered the most animal traps, thereby giving an economic incentive to carry out arbitrary arrests, torture, and other human rights violations. So looking at the Odzala-Kokua National Park in the Republic of Congo, which is home to Baka hunter-gatherer people, this has been managed by African Parks since 2010, when Baka people say that the violence and abuse dramatically increased. Rape, tortures, and evictions at the hands of the rangers have been widely reported. While the Baka are being persecuted for hunting to feed their families and accused of destroying the forest, 2 mining concessions are located inside the park and in its buffer zone. There are now reports of plans to sell carbon credits from the Odzala-Kokua Park. We have gathered many Baka testimonies, and you can listen to them on Survival's website, documenting this torture, rape, and arbitrary arrest. As one Baka told us, quote, "This is not conservation, it's destruction." Yet the Baka are the best conservationists. Their relationship to the forest is central to their way of life and their identity as a people, and they will not survive without it as a people. They have in-depth knowledge of forest plants and are expert botanists, using around 500 plants for medicinal purposes and, for example, including birth control. The Baka are also expert zoologists and astute observers of animal behavior. They have dozens of words for the forest elephant, depending on its age, sex, and personality. Studies show that Baka work to improve the forest environment for their animal neighbors. For example, when the Baka harvest wild yams, they often leave part of the root intact in the soil or bury parts of the tubers with the intention of encouraging their regeneration. This spreads pockets of yams through the forest, which are our favorite food of elephants and wild boar. When the Baka make seasonal camps, as they're nomadic or semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers, they clear vegetation, creating secondary forest, which improves levels of light that favor yam in new areas. This has been called paracultivation rather than just gathering. However, many Baka report that all this important knowledge is not being passed on to the younger generations, as parents are too afraid to take their children into the forest because of abusive anti-poaching squads. Then looking at carbon offsetting, in Brazil, 2 recent carbon offsetting cases involved a company called Carbonex, which is a company partly owned by the oil giant Shell. Carbonex allegedly got Tembe people to sign blank pieces of paper and pressurized Payapo people into signing agreements. When federal prosecutors launched investigations into these irregularities, the company cancels its contracts with the communities. And actually, there is in the Senate in Brazil, they are now debating a bill on regulating these companies. Many Indigenous peoples have been locked into non-negotiable contracts, which run for 50 years or even more. Clearly unfair, as nobody can predict conditions of future markets. Some face draconian conditions and have effectively lost control of their resources and are banned from harvesting produce or cutting down trees. Others receive a paltry percentage of the profits, most of which goes to the companies and the smallholders, while the Indigenous peoples on the ground are doing the work conserving the forest. In some cases, it has proven nearly impossible to track whether offsetting projects have actually taken place and how much carbon has truly been offset. A recent investigation into Vera, the world's leading certifier of carbon offsets, found that more than 90% of the rainforest offset credits were likely to be phantom credits and did not represent genuine carbon reductions and may have worsened global warming. And the territories of peoples living in isolation, as various people have mentioned already, are extremely vulnerable to NBS projects. Their rejection of contact with neighbouring peoples and national society means it's impossible to obtain their free, former and prior consent on their land for carbon offsetting. And just to point out, we're talking about biodiversity, but cultural diversity, as everybody knows, is so crucial. And isolated peoples living primarily in South America, but also in Indonesia and parts of India, are really on the front line. We are talking about populations, the Kawahiva in Brazil, who number about 50 people, the Piripura, who are 3 people. So we are actually witnessing on our watch, in our time, the extinction or annihilation of entire peoples and all their knowledge. So what are the solutions? The clear solution, and I think for everybody here will be the obvious solution, as many have said, is to recognize the collective land ownership rights. As UN Special Rapporteur John Boyd says, quote, implementing rights-based conservation approaches is both a legal obligation under international law and the most equitable, effective, and efficient conservation strategy available to protect biodiversity at the scale required to end the current global crisis. ILO Convention 169, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples all uphold collective land ownership rights. However, as I think has been mentioned, many states, especially in Africa, Asia, and Oceania, have yet to enshrine this fundamental right in national law. Even where land rights are legally recognized, as in most Latin American countries, there is an ongoing struggle against concerted efforts by politicians and industries linked to agribusiness and mining, oil and gas sectors to overturn these laws which uphold their rights. Scientific studies show that when Indigenous peoples' land rights are upheld, there is minimal or significantly less deforestation and therefore fewer carbon dioxide emissions, fewer forest fires, and high levels of biodiversity, which includes ecosystem diversity, genetic diversity, and species diversity. One study in the Brazilian Amazon found a 75% decrease in deforestation in Indigenous territories that were demarcated and ratified. Indigenous peoples must be the decision makers in all projects, initiatives that affect them and their territories. It is simply not ethical to expect them to engage meaningfully in projects and exchange of knowledge, let alone give their FPIC, when they are not in full legal and actual possession of their territories and thus not in a position to assert full authority over what happens on their land. This needs a radical change in mindset. We need to sensitize public opinion, governments, consumers, scientists, industry, and conservationists to counter the ingrained prejudice and racism which prevails in many regions and which fails to understand that Indigenous peoples are contemporary and dynamic societies, continually adapting and changing, whether hunter-gatherers, shifting cultivators, or nomadic herders. And from my own personal experience working with the Ghana and Gwi San in Southern Africa, I have been so struck by their extraordinary resilience in a very tough environment in the Kalahari. They have absolutely perfected living on the edge there, yet they are being persecuted for hunting sustainably, and many have been evicted from their lands. So recognizing land rights takes not only political will and administrative commitment, but also funding. Governments and foundations should prioritize direct funding for grassroots Indigenous-led initiatives which promote land rights and self-determination, territorial demarcation, land defense and land management, and Indigenous knowledge. And as both Myrna and Torres have said, only less than 1% of funding from international donors for climate aid goes to Indigenous peoples, which is pretty scandalous. This needs to be massively increased. In the absence of the state, many Indigenous communities are mapping out their lands to secure them. Some have produced land management plans and encyclopedias of medicinal plants. in positive collaborations with non-Indigenous scientists and specialists. Many are devising protocols for consulting with their communities. Others have formed groups of forest guardians or environmental defenders, risking their lives on the front line to protect their territories, and many have been murdered for that. So they need the tools, technology, drones, GPS, satellite imagery, video cameras, mobile phones. Another critical area for funding is recording and revitalization of Indigenous languages, which are endangered. And a recent research study showed that biodiversity hotspots contain linguistic diversity, about 70% of all languages. Concerted lobbying of governments and institutions which fund for fortress conservation. For example, following concerns raised by the Baka people and survival, the UNDP carried out its own investigation, which found that rangers supported by WWF were beating up and intimidating Baka in Mesok Jar in the Congo Republic. Survival met with the European Commission team in charge of the Mesok Jar project in February a couple of years ago, stressing it never had the consent of the Baka. As a result, the European Commission is currently working to set up a framework for human rights compliance in the conservation projects it funds, and has supported a consultation project for the creation of the Mesok Jar Park carried out by the Congolese government. It's the first time that this kind of process has been attempted for a protected area in the Congo. So in conclusion, we know that keeping forests healthy is critical for our future. We will only achieve this with a radically different model to the current one that has Indigenous peoples, their skills and wisdom at the centre. We must ensure that Indigenous peoples thrive for the well-being of humanity. This can only happen by recognising the land as theirs by right and by dint of having lived there for generations, caring for and nurturing it. Many people will not survive as peoples unless the violence, invasion and dispossession is stopped. Time is not on our side and governments must act before it's too late. And just in conclusion, I want to quote my old friend, Yanomami shaman, Davi Kopenawa from Brazil. And it's a message I think will resonate with all of you. What the Shapiri, the shamanic spirits, teach us has far more weight and strength than all the white people's money. I would like the white people to hear our words and dream about all they say. If the shaman's songs stop being heard in the forest, white people will not be spared any more than we will. Thank you.